We're going to go ahead and start. Thank you all for coming. I wanted to start by introducing our hugely impressive panelists and then giving just a quick introduction to our plan and then turning it over mostly to them. So today we're really, really lucky to have with us Cecillia Wang, the director of the ACLU Immigrants Rights Project. She's a nationally recognized expert on issues at the intersection of immigration law and criminal law, including state anti-immigrant laws, an expert on racial profiling and other police practices related to immigration enforcement. She's taught courses at this law school on immigration law and the constitutional rights of non-citizens. She's an experienced trial and appellate lawyer with 20 years of experience in civil rights and criminal defense. Among other victories, she's successfully litigated cases against Joe Arpaio's Maricopa County Sheriff's Office for racial profiling and against Alabama's harshly anti-immigrant HB 56. Nasrina Bargzie is a senior staff attorney at the National Security and Civil Rights Program at the Asian American Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. The NSCR focuses on post-September 11 civil rights and human rights issues and addresses those issues through litigation, advocacy, and community education. Before she was at NSCR, she worked for the American Civil Liberties Union National Security Project, and also before that for the firm of Boyce Schiller and Flexner. We asked our two panelists to come here today to help us understand, discuss, and contemplate solutions to the restrictionist policies at the federal, state, and local level that have arisen at a moment of heightened anti-Muslim and anti-refugee sentiment. Xenophobia and fear have always been with us, of course, and have always been embodied in our laws, particularly in our immigration laws. But the problem has also reached stages of new concern in the wake of the attacks on November 13th in Paris, which were described by French President Hollande as an act of war organized by the Islamic State militant group. And those were followed, of course, by the incident in San Bernardino, which received widespread attention because, again, the acts were allegedly undertaken as inspired by the Islamic State. But long before these attacks happened, there were ongoing wars and humanitarian crises in places like Syria and Central America that had driven significant numbers of refugees to flee danger from their home countries and to seek asylum in Europe and the United States. After these events, politicians throughout Europe and the US focused swiftly and keenly on these refugees as a potential security threat. And this wasn't entirely novel. The US was already detaining hundreds of women and children on the southern border, again under the rubric of national security. But these events, in many ways, created an even more hostile climate aimed at particular migrants, a climate in which Donald Trump could receive a disturbing amount of support for declaring his desire to ban all Muslims from entering the United States, and where politicians at all levels of government felt comfortable developing their own anti-refugee policies, even when those policies were inconsistent with the Constitution and international human rights norms. So our speakers today are here to help us think about these developments and about the role that lawyers can play in protecting people from the injustices and harms that occur in an age where fear often speaks louder than justice and compassion. So we're really glad to have them here. I wanted to start by letting each of them talk a little bit about work that they have been doing in this political context, and then I'll ask them a few questions, and then we'll open it up to you to ask them questions as well. So I think we're going to start with you, Nasrina.
Sure. Thank you so much, folks, for the opportunity to come and chat with you today about some of these subjects that take up my and Cecilia's every day. So first and foremost, when we're talking about these communities, I think it's important to define what that community is. And we define it as Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian communities, because it's not just people who are Muslim, but it's people who are perceived to be Muslim. And oftentimes, what's actually happening is that much of this is proxy for foreign policy and for foreign affairs issues, which falls more on geography than it does on religious beliefs and systems. And so those are the communities that we work really closely with at the Asian Law Caucus, and we provide a variety of services, from going out into the community every week and doing community outreach to see what's going on, to see what folks need help with, if they're having immigration issues, employment issues, whatever it may be. And then we do direct services, and our direct services involve folks being contacted by the FBI or other government agents for what end up being pretty harassive voluntary interviews, and we will intercede and just sort of be the voice of reason in making sure people's rights are protected. The other thing that we do is we use litigation as a way to kind of approach the different pieces of the Islamophobia that we're seeing, the different pieces of discrimination that we're seeing. And it's ebbed and flowed at different times. So we've definitely seen in the 10 years that I've been doing this work, there's been kind of peaks and then valleys. And, you know, I think a lot of folks hope that it would start trailing off at a certain point, that these attacks on communities by virtue of their ethnic origin or by virtue of their linguistic preferences or their religious preferences, that we would see a fall off. We haven't. We haven't seen that for a number of reasons, and it's only gotten much, much worse, especially post San Bernardino and post, you know, what's happened in Paris and other places as well. And we've looked at so many different strategies and ways of trying to understand how we get at these issues. One of the things that we've noticed that does end up being helpful is working very closely with local community leaders. And by leaders, I mean mayors, I mean district attorneys, other people like that, to create the space for the speech that's necessary to push back on the Islamophobia and discrimination that we are seeing against these community members. So the very first thing that we did at the Asian Law Caucus the day after the San Bernardino incident was to write to the mayors of 10 major cities in Northern California that have really big Amemsa community populations, and we said, look, we know what's going to happen here because we've seen what happens to these communities. What's going to happen is you're going to see an increase in hate incidents, and you're going to see an increase in bullying against the children of people in these communities, and we need to push back on it immediately. And you can help in that. And the way you can help in that is to speak out against this immediately, to be the voice of reason in your communities when you've got the media and other people leading people to pretty irrational, fear-based, hate-based places. So we sent out those letters. We also met with the mayor of San Francisco and with representatives from the mayor of San Jose and other places to really get out this message that what these local leaders do and what these local councils and cities and what these folks do matters for the eventual experiences of people like all of us who are just trying to live their lives.
Thanks.
Good. So I guess I want to start by talking about what's happening post San Bernardino, post Paris, in the context both of the immigrants' rights movement more generally and over, let's say, the last 20 to 30 years of immigration policy making. As Professor Chacón said, xenophobia and its influence in immigration policy is nothing new. This has been part of the fabric of our national policy making since our nation was founded. And just in the last 20 years that I've been practicing law as both a civil rights lawyer and a criminal defense lawyer, we've seen these ebbs and flows as Nasrina described. So, for example, the interplay between national security events, terrorism events, and immigration policy is this constant back and forth to the detriment of rational policy making and to communities of color in the United States. One thing that has been mentioned a lot during the last several years of immigration reform efforts is that do you know when the best hope of comprehensive immigration reform was? It was in September of 2001 when George W. Bush was president, and it was widely expected that immigration reform would happen legislatively on the federal level, and then the terrorist attacks of 9/11 happened, and we then went into a period of anti-immigrant and restrictionist policymaking that has continued to this day. And what's happened since the summer of 2015 is just the latest chapter in that ongoing cyclical pattern of restrictionist of moves. The other thing I wanted to point out from an immigrants' rights perspective about what's happening today to Amemsa communities in the United States and in the Syrian refugee crisis is that there aren't two separate buckets of policy-making impulses, one affecting, let's say, Latinos and one affecting refugees from the Middle East and from Central Asia. What we've really seen is a paradigm for immigration policy-making that has developed where the federal government, including this current Obama administration, has bought into the notion that the price for immigration reform, that is, the price for a path to citizenship for the majority Latino undocumented population already in the United States, is securing the border. That is a policy imperative, that it's an initial first step, that it's a political necessity to secure the border against, let's say, Central American asylum seekers, largely women and children from the 3 Northern Triangle countries where we're seeing this influx now. And that's the same impulse that is behind some of the policymaking impulses that we see against Syrian refugees or against Middle Eastern refugees. And we see this at the state and local level as well as at the federal level, as states like Texas are both engaged in a restrictionist movement against an undocumented population that is largely perceived to be Latino, and against an incoming refugee population that is largely perceived to be Middle Eastern or Syrian specifically. So I wanted to point out those trends as we talk about this panel, that from an immigrants' rights perspective, these are linked issues. There is a broader resurgence in xenophobia that we are mobilizing against. In particular, I wanted to say that after San Bernardino, actually after Paris, even earlier than that, as you all probably heard, 31 states, governors and attorneys general, announced some form of anti-Syrian refugee move, either stating that Syrian refugee families were not welcome in their states or taking more specific action, like the state of Texas prohibiting the resettlement of Syrian refugees in the state and suing my client, the International Rescue Committee, which is a refugee resettlement agency working in Texas and in other states around the country, and the federal government. At the same time, we at the ACLU brought an affirmative lawsuit against Governor Pence of Indiana for doing the same thing on behalf of our client Exodus Refugee Immigration, which is another refugee resettlement agency that works in Indianapolis and Fort Wayne. And what we've seen since then is that we currently now have 13 states that are moving some form of anti-refugee bill through the state legislature, and in some of those states, multiple pieces of legislation seeking to block either specifically Syrian refugees or in some cases all refugees. And in addition to Texas, we've seen the state of Alabama suing the federal government to block the resettlement of Syrian refugees. I might note that currently Syrian refugees are not being resettled in the state of Alabama by the federal government. So a lot of these policy moves or public announcements by the anti-refugee state officials are largely a political move meant to score political points in a very fearful climate. We are, like Nasrina, focused on advocacy at the state and local level, often opposing these restrictive anti-refugee bills, along with, and as again, I would say relatedly, anti-sanctuary city legislation that has moved because of, sparked by the Kate Steinle killing right here in San Francisco, which similarly launched this kind of policy-making wave across both state and local agencies and government entities and at the federal level. So I'll wrap up my spiel by saying that this is not a new thing. We are confronting a situation where was perceived as an upward trend, a positive, progressive trend in immigrants' rights policymaking has been completely derailed by the acts of certain individuals in Paris, in San Bernardino, and in San Francisco with the Kate Steinle killing. And one of the things that I'm interested in talking about as a panel is that time and again in the immigrants' rights movement, in AMEMSA communities, in communities of color, we have seen that rational policy making has been completely derailed by the acts of individuals, and that entire immigrant populations or refugee populations have been held accountable for the acts of individuals who commit criminal or terrorist acts. And so I think the real challenge for us as advocates, as civil rights attorneys, and as legislative policy advocates is to restore rationality in policy making so that, for example, we don't see these moves to have zero tolerance policies in the admission of refugees, for example.
Great, thank you. So I have a lot of questions that actually relate to many of the themes that you've flagged today. And one of the ones I thought I'd start with is just as we're thinking about, as you put it, when we have the acts of individuals that drive policy and that lead to sort of massively stereotyping types of moves on the part of policymakers, obviously that it creates a climate in which there is a lot of misinformation that's promulgated about particular groups and communities, and that misinformation is both part of the media discourse, it's part of the political discourse and broader social discourse. What are the misperceptions that you encounter in your work that are sort of entrenched as a result of this discourse that you find most frustrating, that you think it's most important for people to challenge head on? What are the myths that need to be dismantled to do this work productively?
You want to start? Go ahead. So I think I just alluded to one of them, which is the sense that discrimination is justified because any risk is unacceptable. Now, what do I mean by that? When I was in law school and college in the 80s and 90s, the racial profiling discussion that was in our public discourse and particularly in law school communities was discrimination against African American men in drug prosecutions, right? And the notion that there were all kinds of police practices that targeted African American men for stops. Not that we've taken care of that problem, right? but that was the assumption. And I think today we've made a lot of progress in the public discourse in that it's not really acceptable in most circles to assume that, let's take as a given, is probably not factually correct, but let's just assume that it is true that African American men are more likely to commit drug crimes than white men, okay? Let's just take that as an assumption. It's not okay to say, because of that, any kind of conduct on the part of the police targeting African American men is justified. But that's exactly the reasoning, that's the logical move or illogical move that's being made by policymakers today. That if you accept as a given, which we don't want to do actually, but if you accept as a given that there are issues with national security coming out of Syrian refugee populations, that the answer to that is we will shut the doors to the country to Syrian refugees because any risk is unacceptable. So that's one of the false premises that I think we've really had an uphill battle trying to tackle. Not to mention that we've got to tackle the underlying assumption as well. But we've really seen this lack of rationality because of these high-profile incidents. I think another, and again, this plays into a very long trend of the criminalization of immigrants. This is, one particular manifestation of it, but I think that's another misconception that has been actively cultivated by restrictionist policymakers and activists.
So misperceptions of refugees. Do you guys want to know what a refugee looks like? Well, you're looking at one. I mean, I was a war refugee from Afghanistan. I came to this country in a refugee resettlement program. I'm one of 6 kids, all of us whom have now gone to college and are contributing to society, but this is not sort of the picture that you see when I think the fearmongers get on TV and start talking about the terrorist threat and all of these other issues. And what are we talking about today when we're talking about these refugees? why are there refugees? There's a humanitarian crisis of crazy proportions going on right now in Syria, and on another level in Iraq, and on another level in Afghanistan, and these people are literally just trying to live and breathe. My sister was recently gone to the Greek island of Lesbos for a 10-day trip where she and other people were literally wading into the water to work with people who were on these rafts, many of them who had family members who drowned in the process trying to get there. People are putting their kids in these vests that don't work, because apparently there's people out there who are selling vests that don't work to these refugees. They are going across these bodies of water that are not built for the vessels that they're on. They are risking every single thing in their life. They're risking their lives, the lives of their children, so that they can just live peacefully, because countries like ours, the United States has contributed to war in those areas. And these people just want what you and I have, just an opportunity to just live and to be. But that's not what we're seeing on the news. That's not what we're seeing out of folks like Donald Trump and other people like that. So those, I think, are the misperceptions that, and I work with community members that I try to push back on. Oftentimes when I meet people, they'll say, oh, well, I didn't realize you were Muslim. Or they'll say, I didn't realize that you were a refugee. And I'm thinking, just because they're putting up a picture of, the one guy that did this one thing that very likely had a mental health issue that had nothing to do with anything going on anywhere in the world, doesn't mean that that is what's actually going on. And so one of the misperceptions that I often try to work with is trying to talk to people about why we are so obsessed with this notion of terrorism. Terrorism it's not a crime. It's either a feeling that you're put in or an intent that someone has to put you in a certain feeling. When we say murder, murder describes the death of a person. What is terrorism actually describing? If we were to sort of go back to the building blocks of what it is that's actually the consequential result of the thing that's happening, maybe we could have more rational conversations about what it is we're actually trying to stop. Because when we put it under the rubric of terrorism, a lot just gets thrown in, a lot gets lost, and what often ends up happening is you have a term like this that is not, applied evenly. So for example, you get the guys out in Oregon who are called activists, and you get, if a person of color had done something like that, it probably would have been called terrorism. Not to say that it's right to call it terrorism in this case either, but it's just to point out when you have terms like this that the media is just using all the time, that you have political leaders using all the time, it distracts us from what's actually going on. And when we're distracted from that, we can't address it.
Thank you. So one of the things that was interesting about the earlier remarks that both of you made was you talked about states and localities in complex ways. So Nasrina, you alluded to reaching out to mayors of various cities for help in communicating about their communities and protecting their communities from acts of violence and discrimination. And you talked kind of about both, right? Reaching out to cities to preserve sanctuary city policies, but also at the same time suing states who are refusing to take refugees in accordance with the federal law. And so one question I have is, what is the role for states and localities in this discussion? What role do states and localities play in the resettlement of immigrants, the incorporation of immigrants? What's the productive space that they can occupy, and what are the limits that they should respect legally?
Do you want to start?
Sure. So we've used various state apparatuses quite a bit to try to address some of the issues around profiling issues related to the Muslim community in the Bay Area. Several years back, we passed a law around racial profiling of Arab and Middle Eastern communities. We've also worked very closely with local leaders around hate speech aimed at these communities. And so some version of that is beginning to pick up in trying to look at different pieces of the refugee experience. So Chicago, for example, passed a resolution in support of the Syrian refugees and basically saying, you guys are welcome here, to put that out there into the space. Tacoma County has done the same thing. City of San Francisco advocates are looking at whether or not that might be the appropriate thing to do here. So a lot of it, at least from my experience, Cecillia, I think will know better about this, but in my experience, especially when it comes to the immigration piece, there's some things that cities can do. So for example, San Francisco is a sanctuary city. Hopefully it will continue to be. Other cities have also passed laws making their cities safe zones, but I think there's a lot that local leaders and state level leaders can do to push back on these issues. They may not have the exclusive authority over immigration granted to them in the Constitution the way that the federal government does, but so much of the pushback on the communities, the discrimination, the bullying, a lot of that is just emanating from people in our own communities. And when you have, leadership, governors, and when you have mayors and other people pushing back on that and actually being the voice of reason, it can create a very different environment.
So we are living in a world right now, in a country right now, where immigration policy is largely being made at the state and local level. Like in so many different areas, because we have a completely dysfunctional Congress, really all the action has happened on the state and local level. And it started because restrictionist activists, including my law school classmate Chris Kobach, who is the architect of so much of the anti-immigrant legislation of the last 10 years, deliberately set about to take immigration policy making to the local and state level, with great success until litigation was used to block some of the more extreme measures. So I think that on the progressive, pro-immigrant, pro-integration side of things, we have taken a page from the restrictionist playbook and have really looked at ways that we can improve integration, improve immigrants' lives where they live. So for example, municipal ID cards, right? Having a piece of government-issued ID that not only gives you lots of practical benefits, but also is a token of belonging to the community. Sanctuary city ordinances in California, looking at the grossly disproportionate consequence of deportation for relatively minor or old criminal conduct, and saying, how can we on the state level affect that? Well, let's make lots of our state sentences max out at 364 days, knowing that a sentence of a year or more can have immigration consequences. There's lots of very innovative thinking at the state and local level in terms of pro-immigrant, pro-integration policy making. So where does that leave us? I think one interesting question that we talk about in the immigrants' rights advocacy community is that we're increasingly moving to a country of blue and red states on all kinds of policy issues, whether it's reproductive freedom or voting, access to the polls. On so many of these flashpoint issues of the day, we have places where there are progressive policies where people can live in a harmonious way in their communities, and there are places where you can't. And as a national organization at the ACLU, we're constantly engaged in this debate about where that leaves us. And among other immigrants' rights organizations, the key issue was ICE detainer policy, right, which was affected so profoundly by, I shouldn't say that. That was affected by the Kate Steinle killing. We have states and localities where people are protected from illegal detentions based on suspected immigration status. And then we have places where they're targeted for police stops because of that. And, the big doctrinal issue that we have to confront is that because our main tool in all of this litigation against anti-immigrant laws of the last decade has been the Supremacy Clause and federal preemption, that theory is a fickle friend, and you have to kind of walk this fine line in promoting pro-immigrant local policies or state policies at the same time that we are challenging restrictionist or anti-immigrant laws and policies on federal preemption grounds. And that conundrum is really heightened by our current presidential campaigns, as we're all wondering who will be in the White House next time around.
Yeah. One of the other things that you alluded to, and that affects your work too, I think, is the fact that the immigrants' justice movement in the U.S. has a Latino face. A lot of times that is the way that the message is received. And there is this sort of divide between the way that we talk about immigration reform issues and the way we talk about refugee issues and national security issues. And they're seen as different or distinct sets of issues. And I think, as you put so nicely, they're the same issue, and they affect communities in very, very similar ways. Are there tensions that you've encountered because of these divides in the way that these two different, not different, but differentiated areas are viewed? Are there synergies that you can draw upon in work that the immigrants' justice movement is doing and has done that help us to think about the refugee issues and sort of bring them back under the umbrella where they are legally and socially? How do you kind of work with that, with those sort of that sort of splintered feeling that these discussions often take?
I think there is a tension, but it's not between Latino immigrant communities and other immigrant communities, non-Latino immigrant communities. I think there is a tension between parts of the immigrant rights movement that are focused on attaining a path to citizenship for people who are undocumented in this country already, and that political calculation that I was referring to. And let me give you specific examples. And maybe I'm talking out of school, and it's being recorded, but okay, here goes. In the summer of 2014, when the actually years-long surge in refugees, asylum seekers from Central America was hitting the news cycle, the ACLU and other immigrants' rights organizations, including the National Immigration Law Center and American Immigration Council and the National Immigration Project of the National Lawyers Guild, banded together, and we were going to file a lawsuit challenging what the federal government was doing to Central American mothers and children being detained at Artesia, New Mexico, and how the federal government was processing these women and children in expedited removal proceedings, which is a fast-track, shortcut, kangaroo court sort of proceeding where you don't even see an immigration judge and are interviewed purportedly about your asylum claims by an asylum officer in the executive branch. And we were explicitly urged by people in the Obama administration and by other immigrants' rights advocate organizations not to file suit. And the reason for that is that everybody knew that Obama was about to roll out his executive action package. We didn't know at that time when it would happen, but it happened in November, as we know now. And this was in August and early September when we were preparing to file suit. And the notion, again, was that, there's this idea that in order for Democrats to get immigration reform done, and specifically in order to get path to legal status done, the Democrats need to prove that they can secure the border. And who do we secure the border against? These hordes of Central Americans who are coming in, these mothers and children. And specifically, the Republicans had been spewing out this notion that it was DAPA, President Obama's Deferred Action Program for Dreamers, that was serving as a carrot, pulling people who were alleged to be economic migrants, people in search of DAPA and a green card, to come to the United States. Well, the fact was that the Honduran, Salvadoran, and Guatemalan women and children that we were seeing across the board were fleeing the kinds of circumstances that Nasrina just spoke about so eloquently. We were interviewing children who saw their parents murdered in front of their eyes. We were confronted with clients who were being so severely impacted by out-of-control gang violence where they live that they couldn't leave their homes. And there was not a single person that we interviewed in this detention center who presented as someone who was coming in as an economic migrant or someone seeking legal status in the United States. And so we directly confronted that tension between people who said, look, if we're going to deal with the undocumented population already in the United States, we need to close the door to these newcomers. Or, just to give another example very briefly, when it comes to immigration reform, we heard Obama say, families not felons, right? And there's always this notion of the deserving immigrant and the undeserving immigrant, when the reality of people's lives is so much more complex, and people have mixed families with mixed status. You have families with people who have criminal convictions. Mm-hmm. And yes, you can be part of a family and a felon. And there's been so little attention paid to restoring individualized consideration of merits in immigration and deportation proceedings. I could go on, but that's the tension I feel, is that when our friends, whether they're in the administration or in other advocacy organizations, or indeed within our own organizations, are trying to play a zero-sum game when reality is much more complex than that. That's where the tension is felt.
That's great. I mean, and to just add to that, you just use the word terrorism and everyone runs. And so even in the immigration field, when we were talking about comprehensive immigration reform, and those conversations started happening, obviously not to fruition, but the conversations themselves happened quite a bit, and there were discussions around making the terrorism grounds even broader. Which, by the way, to give you an example of how these terrorism grounds work in the immigration context, I had a client who had donated money for backpacks to an organization in Palestine that had been determined years after that donation was made to be a humanitarian arm of Hamas. And what humanitarian arm means is that this organization is giving humanitarian aid, and the giving of $1 of humanitarian aid frees up another dollar of terrorism. So under this very, very stretched theory, donating money for backpacks in Palestine equaled terrorism under our immigration laws. I'm troubled by that. I don't know if anyone else is, but they're trying to make exemptions like that even broader. And when you enter into the world of immigration conversations, those are the types of things that a lot of people think, okay, well, there must be a reason they're doing this. And it's that exact type of shadow boxing that permits the communities that I represent to continually just get thrown under the bus in those discussions and in others. And I think one of the reasons for it is that people need to show up. In the last 4 years, I've done quite a bit of organizing work in communities, and I've realized that the reason our voices aren't heard in the immigration spaces, the reason our voices aren't heard in certain places is because we're not there. If there isn't somebody there to say, hey, look, here's what these terrorism grounds actually mean. Hey, look, this is what this is going to mean, and here's how it can apply to other areas and how it can extend. People aren't going to hear those voices of reason, but there is a tension, and it exists because folks in the immigration field are trying to do good. They want to help their communities. It's coming from a really good place. They want to create a path to citizenship. They want to present, kids with DACA issues. They want to do all of that. And they think, okay, well, if I just let this pass, it'll be okay, but it won't be okay. And so that tension is there, and I think it's going to continue to be there. But I think communities on both sides are getting smarter. They are sort of seeing the relationship between the issues. More folks are learning more about each other's respective issues and how to kind of weave them in together and work better as a team.
I want to leave time for the audience questions, so I'll just ask one more quick question, and this is mostly for you, Nasrina. I think we've sort of debunked the myth that the federal government is the only level of government that has anything to do with immigration policy. We can see the active role of the locals in both making better spaces and more restrictive spaces for immigrants and for refugees. But we haven't sort of taken it above the national level and thought about the role that international law can play in some of these in some of these fights. And so I wanted to talk to you, Nasrina, about how you relied on international law and international human rights norms in advancing some of the work that you do. So for people who have an interest in international law, that they can have a sense of how those things can influence organizing, litigation, et cetera.
Sure. So in national security work in particular, one of the hardest things to do in the United States is to actually get through the door. So there are tons of doctrines, standing doctrines, immunity doctrines, state secret privileges, things that basically preclude issues that affect the MEMSA communities from even being heard by a federal court or state court for that matter to get to any sort of actual resolution for the communities that we work with. And so necessity is the spice of life, and as a result, folks in this community, like many other communities that have seen access to justice through the channels that we do have available, looking to the international human rights system. And that system is different than the system that we have in the United States. You get a ruling from there, and it doesn't necessarily get implemented the way a ruling from a federal judge might get implemented. But there's also room to use strategies at the international level that can result in real changes for people and for their experience. So over the last 4 years, Asian Law Caucus has been using various treaty processes to really highlight the experiences of some of the communities that we work with. And to give 2 quick examples, we work closely with Muslim student associations and with Students for Justice in Palestine organizations across the United States. Many of these groups have had issues around their speech being characterized as terrorism or in other problematic ways when, in fact, these students are just seeking to speak about their perceptions around Palestine's humanitarian crisis. And what ends up happening is we've seen that these students' groups get investigated, there's a chilling of their speech, there's an effect on their civic engagement, and there's very little way to sort of get that into the federal courts and to get that through other systems. So what we did is we took it to the United Nations in Geneva, and we appeared before the Treaty Review of the United States and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. And through that process, we were able to have committee members address this issue and say, look, Palestine human rights speech is as protected as any other First Amendment speech in this country, and the State Department, Department of Education, and other apparatuses within the U.S. government shouldn't be treating that speech differently. We think that that actually contributed to getting 3 different Department of Education investigations of that speech dismissed, which was really helpful for us. Another issue that we've been working on recently is the confiscation of passports from people who are originally of Yemeni descent but are American citizens. And so we've seen this happening in Yemen, and the reality is it could happen at anywhere to anyone who traces their citizenship to a non-natural, birth citizenship in the United States. And we actually submitted a report to the Committee on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination when the United States was being reviewed, and we argued that this was basically discrimination of people based on their status as Yemeni Americans. And we ended up not getting any commentary out of it, but what we did get was we were able to pique the interest of a number of reporters working on this issue. And these reporters then went in and spoke with folks in the State Department who were working on this issue. Soon thereafter, we saw a bit of a fall off on the number of reports we were getting of people who were having this type of experience. So there's definitely different ways that people can use the international human rights apparatus to look at, approach, and get some resolutions around the issues that immigrant and other communities are feeling.
So we have about 15 minutes, and I want to open it up to questions from people in the audience.
Nasrina, you mentioned a little bit about terrorism and who we designate terrorists versus who we don't. And I've seen a lot of that recently, sort of this idea of, well, even I think the federal government or the Department of Justice has said that the risk of violent extremism is greater from right-wing extremist groups than from Muslim, Middle Eastern, Arab, whatever, in the United States. And that's true. I don't know because of the attacks we've seen in the past. But there is a disconnect because what we see on the news, for instance, and what the public sees is we may not see all those right-wing extremist events or arrests or whatever, but we do see the Middle Eastern ones. So my question is, how have you or your organization started using that distinction that has been becoming more in the public consciousness in part of your work?
Yeah, I mean, so it's definitely something that we point out. The reality is many of these violent incidents are not by Muslim people or not by, frankly, people of color. Oftentimes, a lot of these violent incidents are by young Caucasian males. We try not to point the finger elsewhere either. I think from our perspective, what really needs to happen is we need to have a national conversation around gun violence and mental health issues and some of the underlying issues that really are the cause of the extreme violence that we see across this country in ways that we don't see in other countries or other places.
You've all alluded to this a little bit, but I was wondering, in your opinion, what is most at stake with the upcoming election and the new vacancy on the Supreme Court?
In the immigrants' rights field, let's limit it to that. So the most immediate question that everyone is asking is, what's the impact on the DAPA challenge from the state of Texas? I don't think Scalia's death is going to affect that because, the Fifth Circuit decided in favor of the state, and we all know where he was coming from on the issue. So if we end up with a 4-4 decision, the Fifth Circuit decision will stand, and I think the question is whether we can get to 5. That's unchanged. I think in terms of the presidential election, there's a lot at stake because as much as I excoriate the Obama administration in every talk I give like this, this administration has done a tremendous amount for immigrant communities. They came in to sue states in Arizona against SB 1070. They have done lots of things on the policy level, on the administrative level, that help to improve the lives of immigrants, even as they've taken some policy decisions that we think really hurt immigrant communities. So there's a lot at stake. Those are all things that, any next president, whichever party he or she belongs to, can undo or can build upon. And I think one really interesting question is, Trump and Cruz have tapped into a vein of xenophobia that I think we all knew existed. But I think any notion that we West Coast elites had early on that Trump was a big joke and that maybe he's being paid by the DNC has dissipated because he is no joke, and he and Cruz have made it okay to say out loud things that were not okay to say out loud before. And I think one interesting question is going to be how that impacts Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Marco Rubio, right, as we go forward. Rubio had been one of the Republican senators who voted for Senate Bill 744, which was, for all of its trade-offs, a very solid immigration reform package. And he is obviously backed as far away from that as he possibly can. So I think there's a lot at stake.
Both as community organizers and an attorney, how do you repackage this problem that we've been talking about and bringing to light sort of confused rationalities and reminding people of the history of this country, whether it's waves of, Irish immigrants, waves of East Asian immigrants, waves of Jews, waves of Syrians being restricted into this country, which is mostly immigrants itself, but sort of distances itself by a generation by saying, well, it's okay because I'm not. Cruz, Rubio, Trump are all children of immigrants even just a generation ago. And so how do you bring that to the consciousness of the groups whom you sue or the groups whom you are protecting immigrants groups from? Just reminding on a basic level, let alone the jurisprudence that's just weighing on these issues. How do you do that day to day, and how do you remind people of history? Just simply, legalese aside, I guess, because that doesn't seem to work.
I mean, storytelling, telling people's actual experiences, and my own experience, telling my experience. At Asian Law Caucus, our history goes back to challenging the conviction of Fred Korematsu in Japanese internment. And that's one of the things I often start with when I talk with folks. I say, look, this is a country that put 110,000 plus Japanese Americans in concentration camps for 4 years and deprived them of their property, of their freedom, and of their dignity. And I think when people think about that, it means something to them. And then, I'll talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act and what that meant, and, what it meant to bring laborers over into this country, build our train systems, and then have no system to address and give voice to their community. And over and over and over again, you tell everyone's stories until there's basically no one left, because we all have a story in this country, every one of our communities, the Irish, all of us, we have these stories, and that's what you have to do. And it depends on who you're talking to. With some communities, I don't need those stories. They know very well exactly where we stand. With other folks, I do have to start with Irish discrimination. Sometimes that's what it takes.
I think that there is an underlying issue of race that we just haven't addressed nationally. And this is something that I've really struggled with, because the ACLU is a rights-based organization rather than a community-based organization. And so our inclination in tackling all these issues in terms of the hearts and minds game as opposed to the courtroom game is very much about confronting the issues through reason, through rights, through explaining how civil liberties and our principles need to apply to everyone. And as my communications department colleagues always remind me, you can't respond to fear with reason. It just doesn't work. And so I actually am pretty pessimistic about that, because when we've tried to tell the stories, for example, of Central American mothers and children fleeing, there's a limit to people's empathy. You run into a brick wall of people saying, we're not even taking care of Americans. This is not our problem, right? Or in the case of refugees from the Middle East, if even one of those people is, going to commit a terrorist act, we can't take the risk. Like, some of them, yes, I recognize some of these people are families, and grandma and 5-year-old or whatever, they're not going to pose a problem. But if even one person sneaks in with them, it's not worth the risk. And so when our opponents are fomenting fears and tapping into something very deep where people feel they have something to lose personally, telling a story, I don't feel it getting there, and that's the great challenge we have.
Thanks. I'm just curious, sort of piggybacking off those last comments. There was a huge surge of xenophobia and Islamophobia and racism post 9/11, but it was 15 years ago, and it just seems to be getting worse. We're getting to the point where elected officials are citing positively to the internment camps and saying, like, see, it was great then. How are we getting to this point? What is the root of this racism, fear, Islamophobia, xenophobia, whatever you want to call it? Where do you think this is coming from, given that the sort of catalyst was so long ago and it doesn't seem to be getting any better?
I mean, one of the things I reflect on is that post 9/11, this country had an opportunity to approach what happened to us from a place of, forward-looking humanism, and instead you had folks like Cheney saying that the gloves are coming off. And so we went down a pretty bad road pretty early, and I think that bad road, coming from our leaders, at the very top of the level, ended up kind of coming downward. And what it has resulted in is something that I think even those folks didn't want. So in a lot of our work, I work against sort of broad FBI surveillance policies and these other things, and when I meet with them, they'll say things to me like, look, we're just trying to keep the country safe. And my response is, yeah, but you're creating this broader environment of Islamophobia and discrimination that's being picked up by local political leaders and other people who are trying to make their mark, and then it's seeping into the general consciousness, and it's creating this bigger environment. And so when you look at the actions that you're engaging in, understand that they have these other domino effects that you're refusing to take any responsibility for. And so I guess I'm not that surprised that we are where we are, considering how we started.
I have something actually optimistic to say in response to that question, which is I think we are better off now than we were in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. After 9/11, I was involved in two lawsuits that were directly related. One was that we sued Donald Rumsfeld over torturing U.S. military prisoners in Iraq and Afghanistan. The other was a series of lawsuits challenging naturalization delays for people who are waiting 4, 5, 6 years to be naturalized, who are largely Muslim, from Muslim countries. And in those days, 2003 to 2005 or 6, all the federal government lawyer had to do was say the words national security, and we would lose. And you see that in all of the Guantanamo decisions, our Iraq and Afghanistan decision, DC Circuit case law was just replete with unbelievable doctrinal decisions, foreclosing Bivens actions, ruling on qualified immunity, that you couldn't even get your foot in the door to litigate these things. Well, I think things are different now, and I think that the courts, 15 years later, have calmed down and aren't as apt to go along with the federal government defendants' view of things automatically. We saw that. I saw that just Friday. We sued, as I mentioned, the state of Indiana for blocking the resettlement of Syrian refugees, blatant national origin discrimination. And the state kind of backed down a little, and the current position they're taking is we're just not going to give the Refugee Resettlement Agency the grant to do this for Syrians, but we're still going to give the Syrian refugees TANF and other state benefits. And the consequence of that is that our client, the Refugee Resettlement Agency, gives job training to refugees and English language training, that sort of thing. And the federal district judge sitting there said to the state's lawyer, the Solicitor General of Indiana, can you explain to me how depriving refugees of job training protects the public safety of people in Indiana? Right? And it was meant in that way, just as it sounds. And he had no answer to that. And I think that in the field of immigrants' rights and national security, Nasrina just won a big case this morning.
I agree. The courts seem to be getting it a little bit
more.
The
courts are not inclined to just lay down in front of the federal government's arguments about national security and their invocation of those magic words. And that's why, I just want to throw in this optimistic note that for you as law students, in this area, despite all of the, common wisdom that the best days of civil rights litigation are behind us, litigation is our backstop in this field.
Yeah.
There is no federal reform coming anytime soon, right? Yeah. The House of Representatives is in complete disarray, and the courts are the bulwark. So that's where we're making progress.
Yeah. And that's unfortunately time. I think we are intending it too, right? So let's thank our speakers.